Allie, about 2 hours to go now. We know Massie is a no for Johnson. Who else are you watching?
There's a lot of names we're watching, though all of them are sort of leaving the door open, hanging out on the fence, however you want to say it. They are not hard-nosed, and that's really important when you think about the stakes here for Mike Johnson, because you're right, Anna, to point out that there's no margin for error because he has already lost the one vote that he can afford to lose. I'll put up for you on the screen, though, a list of some other names that we are looking at closely. The thing that most of these people have in common is they are on the more ultra-conservative side of this Republican conference spectrum. For instance, I'm looking at someone like Congressman Chip Roy, who I spoke to this morning. He's sort of at the center of this hubbub and these negotiations because there are some members who seem to say that if he were to be put in charge of the powerful Rules Committee, that they would seemingly get in line behind Johnson. That could present some problems, though, because Roy has shown a willingness to buck leadership, and putting him in charge of the Rules Committee would basically give him a say over what gets to the floor and what doesn't in terms of legislation. I actually caught up with Chip Roy just in the last half hour or so, and I asked him, is it enough if you become chair of the Rules Committee? Would that get you behind Johnson? He merely told me that's not what this is about for him. For him, it's more about procedure and sort of breaking apart the idea of multiple bills being voted on together, sort of slowing down the congressional procedure here in Congress. But again, you see Mike Johnson there saying he's not going to be negotiating, seemingly learning the lessons of Kevin McCarthy, who sort of negotiated away the gig before he even had it. And now that leaves us to what these members will do when they actually vote. For his part, the president-elect, Donald Trump, who is often at the center of these dealings for the House Republican Conference, has merely wished Johnson good luck today. We'll see where that gets him.
Allie, we heard Johnson say he's not going to be making deals with anybody. So what is he doing to try to win over the holdouts?
Still having conversations, though. I don't know where the line is between a conversation, a negotiation, and making a deal, but wherever that line is kind of where Johnson finds himself at this point. He is doing it on his own, though, because listen to what he said when he was asked recently if he's got Trump making calls for him. Watch.
Are you asking Trump to call people on your behalf?
No, I haven't. No, I met with him yesterday at Mar-a-Lago. We had a great visit. But I think that I think this is going to turn out well tomorrow, and we'll stay unified, and we'll get all this done.
We'll see if that's actually the prediction for today, now that we are a few hours out from the vote. And Johnson has Trump's backing, but will it sway any of these members who, in the past, though they have been Trump backers in some cases themselves, really do march to the beat of their own drum here in Congress?
And Michael, I know you've also been tracking what some of these hardline Republicans want in exchange for their votes. Walk us through that.
Yeah, as Allie mentioned, what we seem to be emerging as one of the biggest asks in really these final hours before the speaker race. Remember, it gavels in at noon. That's when the action begins. Is this demand that Chip Roy be made chairman of the House Rules Committee? Now, I had some reporting on this yesterday, and I heard from sources that Chip Roy himself wasn't asking for this. And I just spoke to Congressman Tim Burchett. He's one of those undecided lawmakers. He said he spoke to Chip Roy just last night, and Chip Roy told them that this is not personally a demand that he is making. But these Freedom Caucus members, these hardline conservatives in the House, they appear to be demanding that Johnson do this in exchange for their support. As Allie mentioned, that would be a very significant move, though there are a lot of doubts and questions about whether Roy would actually get it because his history of bucking House Republican leadership, and also the revolt it could lead to among moderate Republicans. Moderates, people who are more to the left in the conference, are not going to be thrilled about the idea of ceding control of the Rules Committee to Chip Roy. So that's one of these predicaments that Johnson finds himself in as he's weighing the two different sides. No other from the Rules Committee, there was reporting yesterday that some of these holdouts are asking Johnson to make commitments on a host of different ideas, including spending cuts and opening up the process for negotiating big ticket legislation. Instead of having staffers and top lawmakers negotiate some of these high stakes pieces of legislation, they want it to be opened up to more rank and file members. It's a constant call and request that we've heard from lawmakers throughout the last Congress. What the commitment actually looks like, though, that would get the lawmakers on board, that remains to be seen. And of course, as Allie mentioned, Johnson being very clear he does not plan to cut any deals with lawmakers.
And also expressing confidence this morning. Congressman Curbelo, do you think realistically Johnson can get all these votes minus the one by Thomas Massie without making a deal or two?
And I think he can, and it's pretty clear that he has learned from the Kevin McCarthy experience. We watched over the course of that week while Kevin McCarthy was trying to become Speaker how he negotiated over and over again. And what did that get him? Well, it got him ousted just some 8 months later. So Mike Johnson understands that this group of members that we're talking about that you all just put up on screen, they will always make demands that are unreasonable. They do not want any kind of compromise with Democrats, yet there aren't sufficient votes in the House for the policies that they embrace. And of course, yes, a lot of Republicans towards the center of the conference, more towards the swing side of the conference, they resent these kinds of members and they don't want to see them in power. So I highly doubt that Speaker Johnson would put someone like Chip Roy to head the Rules Committee. Without control of the Rules Committee, the Speaker cannot control the floor of the House. So I think Mike Johnson is playing the hand he's been dealt, and he's playing it as best he can at this point.
Is there anyone specific you have your eye on this morning?
Look, I think any of those members might force a second vote, try to embarrass Johnson, try to bring him to the table, try to extract some concessions. But I think outside of just saying that he's going to try to open up the process and be more inclusive of the membership, I don't think he's going to give them anything else because really there's nothing else to give. And I think one of the changes he's made that shows kind of where he is pushing the threshold to 9 members for the motion to vacate the chair to prevent what we saw in this past Congress, where Matt Gaetz, one single member, completely destabilized the House. So I really think Mike Johnson is taking the right approach to this, and I think he's ultimately going to be successful, even if it takes 2 or 3 rounds.
I imagine Mike Johnson's happy Matt Gaetz isn't there today or is no longer going to be in the Congress. Congressman Crowley, Democrats are looking to present a united front this morning. What are you hearing about their strategy?
Well, I think Hakeem Jeffries has done a great job in keeping Democrats together. I think that's the plan going forward. It really shows a stark difference between how Democrats are handling themselves and how dysfunctional Republicans have been in terms of their conference. I think when you look back on the last Congress, probably one of the most dysfunctional Congresses in the history of Congress, and yet, the Freedom Caucus folks, they primarily got reelected. So they think what they have done so far has been pretty good because the constituents keep getting them reelected. But in the end, Anna, I really don't see where they go. Mike Johnson is a real conservative. There's really no alternative. He has a very clean record and background. There's no issues there at all. And he has the support of Trump. So I do think at the end of the day, he's really dealing a deck of cards that are so much stronger than what Kevin McCarthy had last time. And I think the panelists are right. I don't think that he's going to be negotiating. And if he is, it's going to have to take multiple rounds, I think.
Allie, nothing's for certain. If not Johnson, is there an alternative?
This is the game that sort of brings me back to a year ago when the Republicans were left without a speaker after ousting McCarthy. It's hard to replace someone with no one. They managed to do it after weeks of chaos with Johnson. But the 2 names that you hear often, and none of these are being entertained in any sort of official capacity because it really is Johnson or no one at this point. But the other 2 names that you could see step into the fold here are the number 2, Steve Scalise, or the head of the Judiciary Committee, Jim Jordan. Both of these men have deep member relationships. They have taken a lot of steps in the political off-season, getting out on the campaign trail, giving money to members who are in tough races. That's the kind of political currency that jobs and leadership trade on, and certainly both of those men have put in the work in those spaces, but each of them probably carries a whip count of detractors at about 12 to 20 people, and we've actually seen those whip counts come into play before because both Scalise and Jordan tried their hand at becoming Speaker after McCarthy and wildly failed after, 1 round or multiple rounds in Jim Jordan's case. And so you have these names that are out there, but not necessarily in a truly viable fashion. I do think, Anna, that the way this could ultimately play out for the members that are skeptical on the screen, there's also a question of maybe one of them votes present, maybe one takes a walk and isn't on the floor and just finds themselves not part of the vote count. That would end up changing the magic number. It would mean Johnson's no longer looking at 218, maybe he looks at 217, 216. Gotcha. Can't go below 215 because of Democrats, but that's the numbers game.
Yeah, no, good to just kind of walk us all through and set our expectations accordingly and how this could go about, because there are a number of different scenarios. We do know, Michael, that it took Kevin McCarthy 2 years ago 15 ballots to ultimately win the speakership. That was over the course of 4 days. So if this doesn't end today, we know Monday is when the election certification is supposed to happen. So what happens then if there's no speaker?
Well, theoretically, Anna, if there's no speaker, you can't do anything in the House. Members are not sworn in, so they can't vote on certifying the election. And that is a main argument that we're hearing from a lot of Speaker Johnson's allies, folks who say we don't want this chaos right now. We don't want a protracted speaker's race. Instead, let's rally around Johnson so we could be able to certify the election on time on Monday. It's going to be a real question of if that argument is viable and strong enough today and through the weekend to see if we have a speaker.
Congressman Curbelo, I can't imagine President-elect Trump would be happy if his win isn't certified in time. Here he was earlier this week.
I think they'll support Speaker Johnson. He's the one that can win right now. People like him. Almost everybody likes him. Others are very good, too, but they have 30 or 40 people that don't like him. So that's pretty tough.
Congressman Curbelo, do you expect Donald Trump to get more involved here? And is there a risk if he does?
I don't think so, Anna. I think Donald Trump has been pretty clear that while he supports Mike Johnson, he is going to require Mike Johnson to stand on his own 2 feet and to garner the support he needs inside the conference. So it's up to Mike Johnson to close this deal today.
It sounds like Donald Trump played a key role here in getting these 2 holdouts over the finish line. At least that's the story as Keith Self tells it. He said he had multiple conversations with the president-elect today, and that was involved, if not pivotal, in getting him to a yes. Ralph Norman has yet to tell his side of the story, although I'm anxious to see him walk down the hallway behind me here in the next few minutes. I talked to Dusty Johnson, who was in that room where these conversations happened, and he said, you know, the main point here was just trying to make sure that everyone was on the same page and that Republicans understand that they do have the same goals. Now, for both Norman and Self, the top of that list of goals is sort of structural, making sure voices like theirs, particularly in the case of Self, fairly junior members, can be heard and considered, and the work around cutting spending can be brought to the forefront. Obviously, that's a big priority of the president-elect as well, with that Doge commission involving Elon Musk. But Johnson's allies are insistent he gave no specific commitments other than to say, yes, we're all on the same team, we all have the same goals, and let's get started, Alex.
Okay. I know, Garrett, I see you looking out the corner of your eye, and so please do keep an eye. If you get Keith Self, I know you're after him. You're welcome to come back to the camera and do a live interview for us. But let me bring in Denver Riggleman now, because a former congressman and friend of ours. Are you surprised Johnson was able to avoid a prolonged drama? Or did this constitute a drama in your mind, given the length of time at least it took to pass on this first vote?
You know, hey, thanks for having me. I think it's pretty indicative that Donald Trump, owns the party. I was talking to another former member friend of mine, Alex, and he goes, it's a bit messy, right? When you know that the only reason Mike Johnson is up there is because of the president, and what's going to happen, right, over the next 6 to 9 months. Because if you look at the slim majority right now, Alex, I think this is a no room to breathe Congress, because you're probably going to have a Democratic Congress in 26. How are they going to do this, right? I was, when everybody was applauding when they got sworn in, I've been there, Alex, as you know, when that happened, I started to laugh a little bit, because it's almost like they're applauding for their own misery in the torture chamber that's going to be the next 2 years in the House. Because right now, I'm not really that surprised. I knew there were some of the individuals there who like to drink their own bathwater, and they definitely want to vote for what they think their conscience or their ideologues, that we're going to vote that way. But again, taking them in the back room, those were phone calls. You can't take a call on the floor. That's why they went into the that little annex there. And Donald Trump told them, hey, get in line. And that's really what happened today.
Give me a sense, because you have been there, what is this like for members of Congress being sworn in, let's say for the first time? I mean, there's certainly got to be a lot of pride, but a certain amount of trepidation, because they've been elected to do a job, and it may be that Congress will not go along to allow them to make good on the promises they make when they're campaigning.
You know, Alex, you lose your idealistic streak in about 7 minutes.
Wow.
Especially when it's very, very quick. And so when you're going through those first days, you're getting in your committee assignments, you're sort of overwhelmed. You know the importance of the job, but you start to see the people around you, and it really is true. You're like, well, how did they get here? And they might be thinking that about you too, right? But I think what you're seeing now in the 119th is that we have a system that's not ready for the 21st century. You know, there's so much corruption, not just corruption with quid pro quo and pandering, but there's a rot. And I think you're starting to see that with our debt and our deficit. So those members that are sitting there right now is, what do you do with such a slim majority if you're in the GOP? If you're on the Democratic side and you see something good that's happening, are you going to vote with Mike Johnson when he's getting his directions directly from Trump? What is that going to do in their districts in 2026? I think this is going to be one of the most raucous, do-nothing, awful Congresses we've seen in a long time, because I do believe that Trump does run the party, and I think his Article 1 powers, I think they're going to be bowing, to the Article 2 side. There's just a rot that's going on that I don't know how you get out of.
Give me a sense of the answer to the question you posed. If you have a Democrat who sees something good being done on the other side of the aisle, do they vote to support it?
That's I remember I was talking to a couple people in there when I first started, and they're like, you can never support a Democrat no matter what. And you know what happened to me, Alex, because I did on some legislation and, officiated a same-sex wedding. And if you get out of the current now, even 3 Congresses later, I think you're so far out of the current, even on the Democratic side. How do you vote, right? What are you going to do back in your district? Oh, you supported Donald Trump. It's not supporting legislation for the American people. I do think there's got to be a third way at some point, because right now, with such a slim majority, any Democrat that crosses the stream, they could be primaried. Any Republican that crosses the stream is going to be primaried. So now you have this very narrow, slim majority for the GOP. Trump thinks he has a mandate. I don't think he does. I think what you're seeing in Congress right now is complete confusion and really a foundational issue where you have a two-party system so broken with media, with the way that they message. And the fact is, you do have maybe the least talented executive appointees ever. And how is that policy going to flow down to the Congress? I mean, I think it's going to be unbelievable to watch, especially the first 6 months.
Donald Trump has touted Mike Johnson's likability. How important is likability? You've heard the phrase, it's better to be loved versus feared, or it's better to be feared versus loved. I'm curious how somebody who's pretty much liked by most members is able to get through the agenda, what the challenges are for that. Does it make it easier?
You know what? I think there's a confusion in terms, Alex. I think liked and malleable got mixed up here. But I do think, Mike's very malleable, right? He's still new to the job. He is going to do exactly what Donald Trump says to do for that agenda. But being liked is great. Listen, I know Mike Johnson, and he is a likable human being. Treats people with respect. There's something about him, that you like, when you're around him. And it really is something that can captivate certain types of individuals. For people who are looking at this realistically, his job is to govern, is to push through legislation. But we really have a tough time to separate those powers right now. So I don't think it's likable. I think it's malleability. I think Mike Johnson might want to be one of the most malleable speakers that we've ever had, even though he's also liked.
Brand new Senate Majority Leader John Thune of South Dakota was spared the kind of theatrics that Speaker Mike Johnson had to endure today, even though he was not the MAGA pick for the job. That title belonged to Senator Rick Scott of Florida. He ran as Trump's sledgehammer. He was endorsed by incoming co-president Elon Musk. But Senate Republicans rejected him in their leadership elections last November. They instead picked Thune, Senate Republican whip, who's a pretty close ally of the outgoing leader, Mitch McConnell. Republicans now have a 53-47 majority in the Senate, which is slim, but nowhere near as narrow as the House. They do still have to contend with a lot of the same internal politics and factions as every other Republican coalition under Trump. Senator Chris Murphy is a Democrat from Connecticut, part of the Democratic leadership team as the deputy conference secretary. Today, he was sworn in by Vice President Kamala Harris. You see him there to serve his third term in the U.S. Senate after being elected by the people of Connecticut last year, and he joins me now. Senator, good to have you.
Hey, how are you?
I'm good. Congrats on term 3. I think you outran the top of the ticket by more than any other Democrat, if I'm not mistaken, or you were thinking the top 2 or 3. And I think I've spoken to you about why that was. How are you thinking about you and the Democrats' posture going into this Congress How is it maybe different from 2016? Is it different? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, listen, we're the opposition party. We are in the minority in the House and the Senate. We don't have the White House. And so our job is, to make sure everybody understands what's going on right now. And it is a wholesale takeover of the United States government by the billionaire and corporate class. We are turning into an oligarchy as we speak. And second, to raise the alarms on what is a really dangerous assault on democracy that has been underway since the election and will continue after the inauguration. It's just not hyperbole to suggest that we might be looking at Democrats being locked up, media companies being shut down by this new administration sometime in the spring. So, listen, I'm all for rebuilding the Democratic Party. I certainly have thoughts on how we can become a much more aggressively economically populist party that reaches out to folks who had been duped by Donald Trump into thinking that he was the economic populist. But let's be honest, Democrats aren't going to pass anything in the next 2 years. So we have got to make sure everybody in this country understands what the Republicans are trying to do. That is to steal your money, cutting things like Medicaid and Medicare in order to finance another giveaway to billionaires and corporations. That is the beginning and the end of the Republican agenda, and that's what Democrats have to talk about.
Well, and to me, the most salient new development in all this is the Musk factor, which genuinely strikes me as new. It wasn't a factor in 2017. I don't think I've ever seen anything like it in the 20 years I've covered American politics. Truly, I can't come up with anything, any precedent, any analog to the world's richest man who spent $250 million. And, when there's a shutdown fight in Congress, the speaker is calling two guys, the guy you see on the right of your screen and the guy you see on the left. Just hasn't happened. And I wonder what that means for how you think about opposition, particularly along the lines you're just describing about this billionaire takeover.
Well, listen, this isn't spin, right? It is just true that Musk is the co-president. That's maybe a charitable interpretation. He may be more powerful than Donald Trump. And the fact of the matter is, Musk is trying to get close to the White House because he makes his billions off of government policy. He makes tons of money off of production in China. So he wants to manage the relationship in China so that he can continue to make lots of money. And the car subsidies and the rocket subsidies that come through the federal government are a big deal to him as well. So he is a perfect example of a number of oligarchs, of billionaires, of corporate titans who are surrounding Trump in order to steal from ordinary Americans, right? Cut our benefits, our kids' education, our grandparents' health care in order to turn a billionaire into a multi-billionaire. And Musk is well known, but he stands there as a perfect example for the American public as to what is fundamentally wrong with the Trump administration, how it is going to be an oligarchy, a kleptocracy, call it what you will, but it's just in service of the billionaire class.
On the nominees, which will be one of the first big fights. And obviously there was already a defeat for the incoming president with Matt Gaetz. I mean, even Senate Republicans said, no, are you joking? John Thune, I think some of these are winnable battles. I don't know. I'm not doing the vote counting, but, you got to get 4 to your side. And I think the notion of Kash Patel as FBI director is obviously ludicrous and dangerous. Here's the Senate Majority Leader Thune talking about those nominees. Take a listen.
Does that mean you already know some of your Republican senators won't vote to confirm Kash Patel at the FBI or Pete Hegseth at the Pentagon?
We don't have, at this point, I don't think, clarity on that. I think these are nominees who are new enough. They've been going around and conducting their meetings, which I think, frankly, have gone very well. But they still have to make their case in front of the committee.
It seems to me like the hearings are real, right? That senators and the American public should take them as real, and these are not as foregone conclusions. Is that how you approach this?
Yeah, I do see these nominations as winnable fights, but Democrats have to fight the fights. And frankly, Chris, I don't see that happening across the Capitol right now. I mean, I've been talking ad nauseum about how Kash Patel is being put into the FBI literally to destroy the rule of law, to enable Trump's dream to put his political opponents in jail. Why are we giving RFK Jr. a pass? Okay, he wants to ban pharmaceutical advertising. That's nice. He also wants to kill our kids. by withdrawing vaccines from our schools and taking fluoride out of our drinking water. Yeah. I mean, Democrats have to fight these nominees, and not just like once a week, every day, because the only way that Republicans even consider voting against them is if the temperature has been turned up all across the country. And I just worry that we are not working the way we need to work against a nominee slate that is just absolutely bonkers and out of the American mainstream by a million miles.
I think that's a fair characterization. Senator Chris Murphy, thank you very much. Good evening from New York. I'm Chris Hayes. Well, here we go. Mike Johnson has been elected Speaker of the House on the first ballot with an asterisk. Technically, as a pass-fail in the very first round of this new MAGA era of governance, it was a pass by the barest possible margin. But if you were grading Mike Johnson's performance today, and the Republicans in general, I don't think you'd give him an A. Now, again, on paper, this should have been straightforward pro forma vote. That's what these traditionally have been until this era. Republicans control the House of Representatives. Donald Trump, the incoming president, gave Johnson his complete and total endorsement, and so you'd think that's that. But a group of 9 House Republicans were reluctant to back Donald Trump's guy, and with Johnson working with such a narrow majority, 9's a pretty big number. Now, after initially airing their dissatisfaction, 6 of those Republicans who originally didn't even vote, right? They eventually came back into the fold. Still not enough. There were 3 other congressmen, Thomas Massie of Kentucky, Ralph Norman of South Carolina, and Keith Self of Texas, who all voted for someone other than Johnson, which would doom his ability to get elected on the first ballot. It looked like Johnson was going to go down. He'd lost, basically. But wanting to save face, Johnson held the vote open for an unusually long time, instead of tallying the votes and moving on to the second ballot. During that time, he huddled with Representatives Norman and Self, presumably offered them some kind of deal or cajole, enticed. When Donald Trump himself got on the cell phone with the 2 congressmen, well, then apparently things changed. According to Congressman Norman, Congresswoman Nancy Mace, remember her, called Trump on her cell phone from the floor of the House. Trump was, you'll be shocked to hear, on the golf course at the time, told them, I'm playing golf. Mace handed her phone over to Norman. A conversation was had, multiple conversations, in fact, and then the 2 congressmen changed their votes to Mike Johnson, handing him on the speakership. So Johnson can technically say, won on the first ballot. But again, a little shaky. Hardly a resounding vote of confidence. In fact, 11 Republicans then signed a letter to Johnson, effectively saying they only voted for him so as not to delay the certification of the presidential votes on Monday. That happens on January 6th. I don't know if you knew that, but January 6th is the date that happens. It's going to happen on Monday. And warning Mike Johnson to watch his step. Now, this sends a message that it is not a united conference. Remember, they're talking about a whole big, ambitious legislative agenda. They have not resolved any of the internal conflicts that have caused all the chaos through the last 2 years when they didn't really have a big agenda. Remember, they have burned through a speaker and a temporary speaker and finally landed on Mike Johnson. And all of this today speaks to a broader question that I genuinely think is underappreciated in the post-election take-fest. And it's this. How much political capital does Donald Trump have? On day 1 of his presidency, right, January 20th, takes the oath, Donald Trump will already be a lame duck president. He is term limited by the 22nd Amendment. And that isn't to say he won't do dangerous, reckless, destructive things, or maybe even try some cockamamie scheme to stay in office. It's not to say he doesn't control the Republican Party. He very much does, right? But it's also true that with every passing the day, the way this works is he sheds a little more of his political capital. I think arguably that it was at its highest point around, 2 in the morning, the day after the election, right? Right after he pulled off, I would say, truly the most improbable political comeback in American history. And right shortly thereafter, Republicans were saying things like this.
There's no question he's the leader of our party. So now he's got a mission statement, his mission, and his goals and objectives, whatever that is, we need to embrace it. All of it. Every single word in his mission statement. If Donald Trump says jump 3 feet high and scratch your head, we all jump 3 feet high and scratch our heads. That's it.
Sort of a kind of beta approach to life, but you do you. But things move fast in Washington. 2 weeks ago, you had this big shutdown fight where Elon Musk rushed in, remember, and he took the lead. There was a kind of vacuum, right? It was just going to go along, and then Musk went crazy on it. Again, he was the initiator. He was the source of energy, and he had a demand. And his demand, remember this just a few weeks ago, right, was to cut spending from this government funding bill and to pare it down. And then Donald Trump, not wanting to be upstaged, he rushed in with his demand, right? And he asked Republicans, in fact, instructed them with a threat of a primary that they had to take care of the debt ceiling, or he would primary anyone who doesn't. And so what happened then? Remember? Republicans listened to Musk and not to Trump. They did cut the size of the bill to keep the government open. They shed a bunch of stuff. They did nothing on the debt ceiling. And as far as we can tell, Trump was just like, okay, fine. Now, over in the Senate, things aren't looking like completely rosy either. Remember that Senator Rick Scott of Florida lost the vote to be Senate Majority Leader. He was running for that position for a while. And you might remember he was the one who said that the Senate should entirely give up its role to advise and consent on cabinet picks. Right now, it doesn't look like that initial plan is going to happen. That was the big thing they all said, right? This sort of shock and awe announcement. They're going to just recess them and appoint everyone. And again, speaking of Trump's cabinet picks, which are sort of early tests of political capital, he's already had 2 of them go down before the year even turned over, right? Before the confirmation process even began. The Republican Senate refused to really even entertain the idea of Matt Gaetz serving as Attorney General of the United States. And, who could blame them? Trump's pick to run the DEA, Florida Sheriff Chad Chronister, had to withdraw from consideration after just 3 days, apparently because the Republican base thought he had been too strict about COVID restrictions back in 2020. All of which is to say, again, maybe Donald Trump is not quite as politically strong as he wants you to believe. Again, there's context, there's history here. Lame duck presidents, historically, have struggled to push through bold agendas. Here's what George W. Bush famously said just days after he won re-election in 2004, when he was sort of at his peak as well. And it's the first time a Republican won the popular vote since his dad's win in 1988.
I earned capital in the campaign, political capital, and now I intend to spend it. It is my style. That's what happened after the 2000 election. I earned some capital. I've earned capital in this election, and I'm going to spend it for what I told the people I'd spend it on, which is, you've heard the agenda, Social Security and tax reform.
Oh, yeah, the agenda. Tax reform, meaning enormous tax cuts for rich people and privatizing Social Security. That was the big, bold agenda. He was going to use his political capital to privatize Social Security. Privately, Bush was telling his allies this, quote, "We have to move quickly because after that, I'll be quacking like a duck." Right? He understood the longer time goes on, the more the political capital drains out of you. And he wasn't able to privatize Social Security, in large part because Democrats united against it. His party then got shellacked in the 2006 midterms. And then remember this thing called the global financial crisis happened under his watch? He was historically unpopular, his approval rating dropping to just 25% during the 2008 election. Again, the past is not prologue. Things may go completely differently this time around. But this is just the last time that we had a second-term Republican who was a lame duck, quacking like a duck, as he said. Now, Trump's situation is genuinely unprecedented. Remember, we haven't been here before. In the country's history, he is the first president since the introduction of constitutional term limits to serve a second non-consecutive term. So, again, we got no idea how things are going to unfold. There isn't really a playbook. Like Bush in 2004, Republicans have a big agenda. Weirdly enough, it involves huge tax cuts for corporations and rich people, maybe going after Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Some things never change. The Republican Party has political power. There's no question about that. They won this election. No question about that. But the question of just how large that power is, how absolute, how disciplined they will all be, how long it will last, all of that is very much an open question.